Good afternoon. Welcome to this session on trade. When I was a trade minister many years ago, trade used to be boring. It's not boring anymore, but maybe some people would have preferred trade to still be boring. Now it is everything else than boring. We know that trade has, though, played an incredibly important role in global economic growth. For decades, trade was the engine behind growth. So trade grew faster than the global economy and brought growth with it, employment, opportunities. Then, of course, this led to a situation where there was started the debate about trade and investments. And the situation today is that for the first time in decades, we see that trade is now growing slower than the overall growth. Last year, we saw a little bit of a rebound on trade. It was growing a little bit more than the average of global growth, but we are now back in a situation where we can even see that trade this year can contract for the first time. WTO, World Trade Organization, said that we could even see a situation where trade this year will contract with 1.5%. Let's see. I think where there is global consensus is that we need economic growth for prosperity, but there is also discussions on making sure that trade is more fair, is more inclusive, and that it also creates jobs globally. We have a great panel to look into the crystal ball on trade. On my right-hand side, we have Hassan Ektabi, Minister of Investment and Foreign Trade of Egypt. Welcome. We have Victor Chu, Chairman and CEO of First Eastern Investment Group, based in Hong Kong. We have Marjorie Krause, Founder and Executive Chairman of APCO, US-based. We have Minister Valentino Valentini, Minister of Enterprise and Made in Italy. That's the title. Then we have Leo, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Wusava Advisory, People's Republic of China, also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Let me go to you, Minister first, Minister Ektabi. Egypt is expecting more than 4% economic growth this year, 4.5. So that's almost like the growth in China, expected to be 5%. But we also know that Egypt is a trading nation. So where do you see this trade landscape? What is your view on tariffs? What is your view on multilateral trade being more challenged, seen from an emerging economy like Egypt?
Thank you, Borge. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in the summer Davos, but it has been great, and I think I'm enjoying all the discussions. I think as you started your introduction, I think when I took this job, I never imagined that trade would be such a fun job. It's just, there is no dull moment since we started, especially beginning of this year. But I think, at least let me focus on Egypt. I think I am a believer that trade is a major catalyst for investments and for job creation and for the development of the world and for the countries in that perspective. And when I took the job, one of the key pillars of what I want to see Egypt is I want to enhance Egypt trade competitiveness to at least top 50 within a couple of years, because that's the key catalyst for me to be able to achieve some of our objectives, to take our exports from where we are 10% of GDP to 20 and 30% of GDP. And investors would want to see that efficiency in trade. So this year only, in the first year of my tenure in the job, we've put a target to cut time and cost in the trade, in the border, in import releasing by 75%. And I'm assuming that next year we'll have a different target, but we need to be as competitive as possible in that. The second element on our trade is the bilateral trade. And I think, in my view, we need to put context where we are today. I think the globalization that the world have enjoyed for almost 3 to 4 decades is fading away a little bit. And I think this is not an outcome of today for this 2.0 Mr. Trump, but I think it's a product of the first term. And I think we started to see nationalism, we started to see borders, we started to see limitations to trade, in my view, after the global financial crisis. I think today we need to see trade in a different eye. I don't think the concepts of what the world have enjoyed of efficiency, just-in-time operations, that made this remarkable recovery in this part of the world, in China and Southeast Asia. Today we're moving to resilience, supply chain shift, and we're moving back to borders. And I think the future will be to bilaterals. And I hope we can preserve the principles of the WTO, because I think that's what matters. This is the most important. If we don't have rules to trade, I think it will be a very difficult way to navigate the world. In the case of Egypt, we have a lot of trade agreements. We have EU partnership, so we have this partnership with the EU. We have a trade agreement with the US. We have 3 trade agreements within the continent of Africa. We have an Arab free trade agreement. We have a Mercosur to work with the Latin American countries. And I think today what we're trying to do is to bring, as you rightfully mentioned in the beginning, is the balance between investment and trade. So in the relationship with the EU, for example, we have a trade deficit, and it's in the favor of the EU countries. The way we're approaching this is upping our game. One, I'm eliminating all the historical non-tariff barriers that we had previously. So I'm eliminating one by one to free trade. Second, I initiated to our partners in the EU that I want to take our level to the Sustainable Investment Framework Agreement, the CIFAs, and that's an important step. Next week I'm in Brussels, and the discussion would be we need to equalize the trade deficit with an investment. We need to talk about the introduction of the CBAMs, which we call it in emerging markets, it's a tax on emerging markets. We need to talk about this for the development of the trade. Exactly the same discussion I had yesterday with my counterpart, the trade minister here in China. We need to equalize that trade through investments and trade. And the Chinese are investing in Egypt, the Europeans are investing in Egypt. So for me, the trade is a relationship between partners that we need to nurture, we need to talk logic, we need to make sure that we reach balanced trade agreements, but not through tariffs. That's our belief, it's through investments and trade. And to your final point is about tariffs and about what we're seeing in the world. Again, our focus is to make sure that we're opening trade to the max. We want to be as competitive as highlighted possible. In the case of the US, for example, prior to the tariff that has been imposed, Egypt is in the 10% category, which puts us in a favorable place. But as I said, our agenda is very clear. We are clearing all the non-tariff barriers, or the tariff barriers, if any. We want to liberalize the trade relationship. And ideally, I would want to do the same as I'm going to do next week with the European countries. I want to do that with the US. I actually want to deepen the relationship with the US. We want to expand the QIZ, the Qualified Industrial Zone. We're actually talking to both the European as well as the US about being part of the IMEC, the India-Middle East corridor, because we are part. We've put the infrastructure that is needed to connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. For us, trade is a key catalyst for where we want to see Egypt. As I said, our aspiration, I think it's very doable with our competitiveness today, is to take where we are in terms of trade to multiply it by 3, and in a very short period of time. I think it's doable.
Thank you so much. I'm turning now to Victor Chu. you have also been a big investor in foreign countries. You're based in Hong Kong, but I know you invested also in Japan and other countries. A number that was quite striking is that foreign direct investments have been contracting in the last 2 years. So last year, there were 14% less investments compared to the year before, and the year before was also 14% less investments. So trade has been holding up relatively okay-ish, while investments are on their way down. Have you felt this? Are you worried about it? What can we do about it?
Very, very good question. And the answer to the first question is absolutely. I think there's a combination of reasons. One is that in terms of private equity investment worldwide, the exit strategy has become more challenging, particularly through the IPO world in a normal way. Secondly, the global geopolitical uncertainty is certainly a major risk. But more recently, the tariff challenges made global businesses very, very challenging, because if you were to build an additional plant today, you can't price your investment because you don't know what the actual pricing will be 3 or 4 years down the road. So everybody's pausing. And then, of course, there were feelings that if you invest in certain countries, you get a pressure from other governments. So I think these combination of global uncertainty, the fragility of the economic cycle, and the difficulty of exiting from private equity investors, and then the tariffs and the supply chain challenges are all going to hit the direct investment, which is a shame, because FDI actually improves the capital flow and therefore the governance and the quality of trade, peace, and also mutual interest. So I think we will still see a bit of disruption before we get back to normal.
We have seen quite a pickup down in the interest for Hong Kong, because Hong Kong was struggling at a certain time, but I think the stock market is even now seeing more and more companies as wanting to be listed. How do you explain that? Because things in other places look more grim.
Well, thank you for highlighting this, Boga. We are, in a way, a beneficiary of the tussle between other markets, because a lot of the big Chinese companies listed in the American market finds it more appropriate to come back to Hong Kong, because we're a big market, we're open, we're liquid, and also, of course, despite some friends felt otherwise, our rule of law is robust, and we've enjoyed many years of the London model, which people are familiar. So English law, a huge market from China. So also the big IPO prospects from China in the foreseeable future, their first choice will be Hong Kong for the IPO. And as you have heard, our finance minister said over the lunch, we remain open, resilient, and welcoming to everybody, not just from China, but in the international world.
Well, thank you for that sales pitch, too.
Thank you.
It is true, though, I wasn't aware, but Hong Kong is still the third most important financial market in the world, after New York and London. That is then a segue into Marjorie Krauss, founder and executive chairman of APCO Worldwide. has been to summer Davos many times, but also been in Davos, winter Davos, for decades, based in Washington, D.C. when you're not traveling, something you do most of the time, I think. But there is, of course, a lot of interest in the U.S. Trade policies.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yes, I know. I'm trying to be diplomatic. Yes. And we're an impartial platform at the World Economic Forum. But what would be interesting to learn more about, and since you work with the largest companies in the U.S. and advise them, we hear a lot about what other countries think about the U.S. tariffs, and also what the business sector feels about it. But what really do the big CEOs and the businesses in the US think about this? Because some of them would maybe gain from the tariffs, some of them would lose. What do they think about this current trade policies? I don't know how political you want to be, but you find your way.
It's very interesting because even if you were to benefit a lot, I think you wouldn't voice that. I think as a whole, this uncertainty is very bad for business across the board. I think that, you know, these companies, you can divide them into buckets. You can say the large global companies that are headquartered in Washington. We do work with foreign companies that are also looking at this. They are unsettled by all of this. How do you make plans? It's what you were saying. How do you make plans about supply chain, about pricing, about how much inventory you're going to have? The whole thing is disrupted because of the fluctuation and the uncertainty about what the tariffs have done. And, you know, just history, if people remember back, the last time the U.S. has had this much disruption on the global market was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 30s, and that led to something unimaginable, but you know, a depression around the world. And I think there's a lot of concern that we don't know where this is going. And even when the announcements are made, the next day they change, as you know. I mean, at one point we had 145% tariff for China, which, you know, could never survive. But the unfortunate part of that is also, it's not just the big companies, because what we don't see is all of the people in the supply chain and all of the small and medium-sized businesses who are impacted greatly by this fluctuation. An example of that is, I have a friend who is in the fashion business and has been in the business 30 years. She has 2 factories that make her goods. She's a mostly US provider, and those 2 factories are in China. And so, you know, even for her to continue in business, even though maybe it's not a global player, not somebody you'd hear about, it just is totally impossible to plan for the business. So what are the companies doing? I think that one of the most interesting things is when I started my business 40 years ago, we did a lot of work on international trade, and it was, as you said, a boring subject, and one that people just didn't talk about a lot. And now it's something people, it's on the front burner for everyone. So the companies, it's really moved from having the activities be delegated to a certain part of the company to it moving into the C-suite. And so you have a lot of CEOs having to become much more expert on geopolitics or geoeconomics, and it's not what you learn in business school. And I think they're uncomfortable with how much time this is taking. It's really been elevated as an element of risk. So what you see that's happening with companies around the world that are looking into the U.S., no different in the U.S. for the companies kind of looking outward. There's no way to plan. There's no real sense of security that what they're doing today is not going to impact tomorrow. And
I think that's a nice way of going to Europe, because we know that the next big negotiation is now between the EU and the US. I think there's a deadline of 9th of July where there will be introduced, is it 50% tariffs? Possibly. But it's important also to I think, factor in that Europe is the second largest exporter of goods in the world after China. And Minister Valentini, I was also struck by how important export is for the Italian economy. 1/3 of GDP is related to export. So I guess a lot is at stake for you also in this trade context.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Europe exports some 700 billion worth of goods to the United States, and Italy within Europe is the second largest manufacturing country. We're the fourth largest exporter in the world now, and we export 1/3 of our GDP, which means that certain areas of our economy export 88 to 90%, and we have a structure made up of small and medium-sized companies, most of them family-run. So with family-run, medium-sized companies, the idea of sudden tariffs wreaks havoc. Wreaks havoc for the reasons that have been said before. One, they create uncertainty. So we already see a drop in investment. Two, they work on a situation that didn't start today, but has already started from 2008. It was reinforced by the pandemic, the idea of supply chains that had to be fortified, and we've gone from just in time, a flat global world, to just in case. And just in case means create redundancy because you don't know whether your goods are going to come to you or not. And that was already before this new attitude towards tariffs. So you can understand how difficult it can be and how worrying. Also because the impression is there that tariffs are not used in order to compensate imbalances in trade or temporary protection for certain sectors, but rather they're used as a source of income in order to compensate for, how should I put it, very heavy debt that has to be paid through sanctions, without taking into consideration that you can't apply sanction and think that the flow of goods is the same, so you cannot apply X factor to a given number because that number is going to be affected. Secondly, you're going to create a situation that's extremely bad in a geopolitical situation that's real bad. And I would like to quote to you a very famous economist, a French economist of the last century, that says, where goods do not cross borders, then army do cross borders. Wow. And that's the way to look at it. And I don't think that given the current situation, we can accept that. Having said so, we also, in Europe, we also think that dialogue is the only way forward. There are no winners in a trade war. There are no winners in a verbal escalation. Verbal escalation that we've seen before, it's even worse than the war itself because it provides the condition we set. So the idea in Europe is let's try to calm down, sit down. I would like to draw your attention that tariffs are already in place on steel and aluminum in Europe, 50%. We look if there are certain issues to be taken care of, okay, but we're not going to accept a flat application of tariffs that way. At the same time, we have to avoid another rift within the West in general, but rather we try to use dialogue in order to bring us together. That's the way we look at it. But to answer your question, I'm afraid that's not the last deadline we're going to see, because the idea is deadline after deadline, you kick the can down the road and you keep people on their toes. That's a strategy. It's not a winning strategy.
Very interesting. It will be an interesting July, August.
Oh, yes. That's what diplomats say. When it's a really bad situation, diplomats always say it's interesting times. You got to be worried. When diplomats say that, it's a very bad situation. So it's very interesting times. Yes.
But the situation between the EU and China is more stable, is it?
It is more stable, but when water starts sloshing around the pool, then the waves go all the way, because what is the fear of the European Union? Of course, there are issues to be settled with China. China is a very strong exporting country, and there are issues we were to to discuss in order to even out the field. But now the fear is that given the strength of the Chinese economy, the Chinese are going to dump their products on Europe. So it's a global world. We're all interconnected. We can't think that just take things individually. We can't separate geopolitics from economics, from finance. It's all interconnected. So the situation is good. I think that I hope that this stressful situation is going to send us to reassess our relation to China, invite China also to take into consideration the consequences of its weight, economic and political, becoming a real player, a global player, carries certain responsibilities. So I hope that our dialogue is such that we're able to understand that we all have a skin in the game, like they say, and we want to make sure that we all get out of it safe and our skin is saved.
Yeah, that's the skin is saved.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
A few scratches.
Liu Qian, founder and chief executive officer, Busava Advisory. Skin is saved. Is that a description now on the ongoing trade discussions between China and the US, or do you think we're not yet out of the woods?
I would say that, in a way, many argue that China has won glamorously with Trump's tariff wars, at least so far, at least in this particular terms. So the world was very worried when Trump all of a sudden announced 145%, and they were looking at China thinking the Chinese economy is going to tank. And let me tell you why that's not the case. While sort of the popular image of thinking about China is that China is still very export-oriented, that's no longer the case. 10 or 15 years ago, export was most important. It was 35% of Chinese economy. But nowadays, it's only less than half of that. And within that less than 17%, export to US is only about 10%. That means less than 2% of China's GDP is related to export to the US. So if you think about it that way, China has hedged itself enough away from export to the US. And effectively, we've already been seeing that a few years ago, Europe has overtaken US as the largest export market. And nowadays, it's ASEAN that is now the largest export market. And last year, really, Latin America and the Caribbean, they are the fastest growing export market for China. So in hindsight, we could say that when Chinese government was talking about dual circulation a few years ago, that was already hedging for the possible Trump return and possible escalation of the tariffs. So in a way, that's why we see nowadays export is no longer the leading economic growth contributors to China. Rather nowadays is private consumption. But that's a different story, because now China needs to make sure that number one, we're looking at the average disposable income is not growing as fast, and we have a very high unemployment rate, especially for youth. And then we're looking at the wealth effect, because people were having houses and they were growing for prices, and that's no longer the case. So the lack of private consumption is really the thing that's getting the central government more worried. Obviously, relationship with US and the other countries is not just about tariffs, but it's a reflection of the ideas of how to work with China. So I'll stop with that for now.
No, that was very, very interesting. China has diversified from the export to the US. It used to be 20% of your export. I think it's down to 12% now. That means that 88% of the export of China is going to other places than the US. I looked up the statistics, and China is still the world's largest global goods exporter. The second largest is the European Union. I think that is maybe counterintuitive to some observers, but China number one, EU number two. Then my question is also related to the future for trade. I think now China exports or the trade between China and US is around $500 billion a year. The trade between China and the EU is around $500 billion a year, and then with Asia is the same. How fast do you think China will now continue to pivot towards digital trade, services, and also stimulating the consumption in its home market? Because it seems like people of China have gotten the message, but because of all the volatility outside China, they're a little bit reluctant to start spending. Or do you think this will change?
That's a very good question. So overall, the fundamental sentiment is not so much worried about the rest of the world. There is definitely that, the sort of the hanging uncertainties, but it's really domestic. So as I was saying, for instance, private consumption is about a bit over 40% of the Chinese economy. So that is really the biggest part. Number one, the disposable income has been growing a lot slower than before. Now it's barely over 5%, 6%. Before it was 8%, 10%. And now when you look at the youth unemployment, as I mentioned, while the official number was somewhere between 20 to 25%, I mean, if that number registered in any European countries, you would have a big problem. And some of the actually professors, they were looking at the numbers, they were reporting 45, 46%. And then there's the property market. Even though it's not private consumption, it's really investment per se, but the Chinese Academy of Social Science has this data suggesting close to 90% of Chinese households own a house of some sort. So before, every day you were becoming richer, even if you weren't doing anything. And nowadays, even if you work extra hard, what do you get? You earn not so much more money, you have a higher chance of being unemployed, and your wealth is shrinking. So these are the fundamental reasons why the private consumption. And so that's one. The other one is when you talk about stimulus packages, the government set the target of 5%. Now there has been a lot of discussion of how reliable we can read into that 5%, but take that 5% for now, right? That 5%, when we compare the China size to the rest of the world, for instance, 5% is, of growth is more than the entire size of Switzerland, for instance. So it's enormous.
Thank you for reminding us.
No, but Switzerland is very important. Thank you, Webb. But exactly, I just want to use that to give people a sense of the sheer size of China and how important of that. So if the government feels that, wait a second, we don't need the economy to grow in 10%, 8%. If every year we can still have a solid 5%, we can still have another wonderful, wonderful Switzerland, right? Why do we need further stimulus? Again, you know, we can talk about how reliable that number is, but that's the sentiment, especially with the central government. Maybe you can ask the Prime Minister tomorrow as well. And so that's a lot to look forward to. But to come back to your question, I'd say, the external environment is definitely very, very important because right now we're talking about trade and tariffs. Tomorrow we could talk about further escalation of tech wars. And the day after we could talk about other international security related affairs. So that will always be there. But at least for now, it's about domestic economy and dual circulation.
I was also coming back to the Egyptian minister. An additional challenge globally, if we are seeing slowing growth, is that we're more indebted globally than we have been since 1945. So if there is a slowing down, what kind of fiscal muscles would there be to then stimulate the economy? How worried are you about a combination of slowing growth in trade, but also slowing growth in investments, and that will lead to slower global economic growth, and there is less fiscal muscles there to stimulate. Of course, a big economy like China can do this, and possibly the US, but other nations have a hard time, and know with increased interest, also the cost of the debt is increasing.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question, and I think it describes exactly the situation that the whole world, but mainly emerging markets. You're describing the situation for emerging market. Most of the countries in the emerging market world started COVID and the last 5 years with inflation, accumulation of debt, government needed to stimulate the economy, and now we're facing, the last couple of years of additional wars, uncertainty on trade. So we're entering this phase with the no fiscal space whatsoever. This is the reality of where we're facing. And I think, again, if you take it to the points that you highlighted, I think trade, as I started and you started, most of my panelists highlighted, trade is a key enabler for growth, and that we're seeing trade growth is declining, which means that the global GDP growth is declining, and these are actually figures that we're all seeing. The figures that you highlighted in terms of the FDI report that was published last week is not only telling that we have 2 consecutive years of decline of 14% for 2 years, but more importantly, if you dissect it down, you would see that still the majority of the FDI is still going to safe markets, so the mature markets, which means that emerging markets are suffering more and more. So that decline is actually targeted to emerging markets, which these emerging markets would need this FDI, these investments, to fuel their GDP growth.
Why is that, you think? Because the biggest upside is also in the emerging markets, because you can also get a great yield there, but I guess it's the risk factor.
I think for the past, I come from the private sector, private equity field myself, and the last 10, 15 years, emerging markets are out of flavor for most of the asset managers and in private equity. That's the reality. That's the reality of where we are, with the exception of few markets, but the risk is high, and actually the return has not been stellar. So money is flowing where the risk is less. So it's the US market, it's Europe, and in part Japan and China. This has been the major flow. So combining a trade decline, FDI decline, who's suffering the most? It's emerging markets. And again, you're right, we don't have a fiscal space because we're entering these years with these tariffs and all of these dynamics on trade with this major uncertainty, with very little fiscal space, and inflation is we're still trying to get inflation down, so interest rates are high. So it's not an easy situation to be in. At least our solution, at least as a minister in a new government in Egypt, our focus is to make sure that we get out very quickly with the structural reform, to make sure that we're seen as a very competitive economy to attract the FDI. Because the fight for FDI, to get a bigger share of the FDI, that the pool that is getting smaller, you need to show that you are a very competitive, resilient, open economy. And that's what we're trying to do.
Have you seen decline FDIs to Egypt too, or?
No, last year, so our FDI in terms of numbers have been hovering between $8 and $12 billion. Last year, we've seen a spike. So actually last year in this report that was published last year, Egypt had a major one-off, in our view, one investment that is $35 billion. So it took our average from the 8 to 12 to 46 billion. And that's why I say it as a Minister of Investment and Foreign Trade. I also remind myself that this is an one-off. What we want to do, if we want to accelerate our growth in GDP and to get to sustainable 6 to 7%, which we believe it's attainable, we would need to double the FDI we get to the country. And that is not easy. That's why reform is key for us to be able to do this.
Is still the GCC the largest investor in Egypt?
It's
the Gulf countries.
I think the last year, of course, because of that, but I think our FDI is quite diversified. So we still have the European, we have the GCC, we get Asia as well. But as I said before, I am betting on the fact that if we do the right reform, Egypt could be the hub for green energy transition and products for the center of 3 continents. And that's what we're betting on, and that's why we're putting all of our efforts in reform to get to that point.
Do you see, Victor, at all a chance for renaissance a rebound for investments in the emerging markets, and what would it take before you invested more in these markets?
I think in the short to medium term is really affected by geopolitics. For example, when we talk about China's reliance on the American market on export, you say 2%, right, net. But actually, we have something called Section 232 in the US-UK deal, which is the first template. Now that's quite dangerous because that basically impose on other countries that will receive tariff relief from the US, but on the condition that they will align with US strategic interests, whatever that may be. Right? Now, right now, it's only limited to the steel industry and pharmaceuticals, but it can be expanded at will. So even though US is 2%, but the rest of the world may be affected by this type of discretionary containment on the free flow of trade and investment. So all things being equal, in the old world, right, where common sense prevails, FDI goes to the place where it is the most dynamic, the most attractive, and also the way that there's rule of law improvement and also the efficiency improvement. But unfortunately, in the short to medium term, the geopolitics really is disrupting that. And we have to see how we can find a way to rise through that in the coming months.
Marjorie, do you think there will be a change also in the sentiment in the US on the trade side, or is this very deep now?
No, I think the question is a change in the sentiment by whom? Because I think the sentiment is in the right place from the business community. The business community just wants to continue to grow and have the ability to go where it needs to go and where it makes the most sense to do business. The disruption in the supply chains has already caused some of these businesses to invest in different places, to diversify, to decouple in some places. And so I think the mentality for that hasn't changed. The real question is, that you're asking is about the government side. And, there's some other things that are happening at the same time we're paying attention to tariffs. This big, beautiful bill that's going in front of the Congress for the financing has provisions in it that people should pay attention to, because there's a certain kind of taxation that will affect foreign companies. There's certain, and especially certain countries. There's a lot of other hidden things in all of this that make it even, I think, harder to think about, the future of the way you're planning to invest. So the question, I guess, for me is also, when you were talking about political risk, it's, in my lifetime, hard to imagine that companies looking at the US or looking at political risk, are thinking about the market in a very different way. So I think for now, you have a president, there's a lot of unilateral action going on. I don't mean just globally, I mean internally as well. Within the administration, there's one person who's making decisions, and it's not the kind of consensus building that has existed in the past. And I don't know that that's going to change until and unless, it does change. It changes on a regular basis, because when the tariffs changed is when the bond markets reacted. Yeah. So I think it's not, I think there's going to be action, reaction, and we're going to be stuck with this volatility for a while. I wish I could say something that was a lot more positive about that.
No, but I think that's a very real political observation. I think we saw a pulling back also under pressure from Treasury and investment when it affected the trade dispute between China and the US also affected the bond market or the treasuries?
I would say one other thing, and this is a positive thing. So I think it's a positive thing. Depends how you look at it. I do think that this administration is, I want to say, open for business. And I don't mean in the traditional transactional way, although it is. I think that I have found that the cabinet secretaries and different parts of the, they're willing to listen. So I think it's at your peril if you don't talk about what your concerns are, or you don't try to shape the feelings or the attitudes about how these things are affecting your business or your country. That you may not get a solution that you want to get, but if you don't talk about it at all, you are probably not on the radar screen the way you want to be. So I do think that's one thing that there's an openness to at least having the discussion.
How worried are you as an Italian minister related to the trade negotiations between the US and Europe? Do you think it will all work out to end up with something that is really manageable, or do you think it's a real risk for a situation where it can really lead to a tit for tat? Also factoring in, I think it's easy to forget, and Minister, you know it very well, that the EU is 27 different countries. So there can be an agreement in principle by something, but there can be upset farmers in one country that then could also derail a big, beautiful agreement between the EU and the US.
You rightly pointed out, foreign trade policy within the European Union lies in the hands of the Commission. So the single countries have ceded their foreign policy in terms of trade to this organization. And that, of course, calls for consensus, because the consensus building mechanism within the European Union calls for unanimity. And that makes things extremely hard. And that also provided, and this in very many negotiations, provide other countries with the opportunity, or at least the idea, the seduction, the threat of trying to peel off country by country from this consensus, establishing direct contact. And that's a threat which is there, like you pointed out, but that happens also in the United States, when in a negotiation you want to obtain something from the president, you probably hit Oregon or some red states where you can hit some communities of farms, etc., that can exert their pressure on Washington. Same happens in Europe. So you're right there. At the same time, am I optimistic or pessimist about the result? As you say, as you know, a pessimist is an informed optimist. So I'm not informed enough to be a pessimist. As I said, I think the game will be protracted, because I don't see on the part of the administration really that they've decided where the point of agreement is, really. Secondly, this uncertainty, if protracted further down the road, is going to create such problems that will be hard to undo them. So we can't wait too much, because already, as it was said, you can turn a temporary consequences to tariffs into a recession. And that's one of the major threats we have to avoid. And uncertainty, if protracted, will then have a fall-down solution. So how optimistic I am, I hope we'll be able to find solutions soon. I hope that this whole issue is going to be decided. I hope the geopolitics is going to push the actors to find an agreement, because it is necessary both economically and politically. But if I can tell you that I look into a glass and I can tell you when that happens, I would be lying to you and the rest. I can only express hopes that that happens. The sooner the better for all of us.
Thank you. So let's end with a Chinese voice when we also are in China. So Liu, looking at the opportunities and the challenges in this big country, 1.4 billion, close to 20% of the global GDP, has been growing with 7-8% for decades. We know that growth is now slowing a bit. What do you think keeps the economic leadership of this country awake at night, and where do you think they see the biggest opportunities moving forward?
Thank you for that interesting question, very important question. There are a lot of, I mean, I don't have the crystal ball of their minds, but I think there are a lot of opportunities and challenges. Let's take domestic and economic wise. So while there are a lot of concerns about Chinese economy, and indeed there are a lot more worries compared to before, there's still a lot of, for instance, innovations happening. Usually when people think about China, they don't think of China as a, let's say, a super innovative house. Because the traditional and in a way the Western concept of innovation is 0 to 1, all the breakthroughs. But China isn't about 0 to 1. China, in a way, I'm slightly stretching the argument here. China is about, for instance, taking 1 and change that into 1.1. And because we have 1.4 billion people, we now have a more than 1 billion US market. I mean, think about companies such as Ant Financial. It started like learning from payable, but then it added its own features. And at the time, when it was going to be IPO listed, it was estimated to be a market cap of 310 billion US dollar. That's a lot more than when Credit Suisse, for instance, more than 100 years company just fall apart. So I'm just giving you a sense of
You're giving Switzerland a hard time, right?
No, because I know you have all the security to embrace all these conversations, right? So that's one kind of, and the other one, for instance, would be China does a lot of 0.1s, but then it does so much of that. I do this industry 0.1, I do that industry 0.1. And take the companies such as CATL, right? It is the largest electric battery house. For instance, Tesla is its biggest consumer. And last year it was launching a electrified plan. And the company, they don't just aim to do battery. Their ambition is to electrify whatever can be electrified. So I'm using all this, or, okay, take a third kind of innovation would be China takes 1 and take another one, and then it creates a 10, and then it amplifies to the world. A good example would be Tencent or WeChat, right? WeChat nowadays, I assume all of you sitting here in China, you can't use WhatsApp, you have to use WeChat. It's effectively a combination of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. You can do Amazon kind of shopping, you can get your taxi, Didis from it. So innovation is really something, and technology, China has effectively been the leader of a lot of technological superhouses, and then there's a lot of talents around this. I won't go into details. So that's something that keeps me very hopeful. But I am overall quite pessimistic about the global collaborations per se. So what would be the end game here, going back to what you were asking? Usually when people talk about international relationship, and especially US-China relationship, the default theory is that it is trap, right? So you have a dominant power and you have an emerging power. When Professor Graham Allison looked at this, throughout history, there were 16 times that we saw similar incidences. And among the 16 times, 4 times didn't go to war. So what does that tell us? That number 1, the odds aren't great. Number 2 is still possible. So I think now we're at a very critical historic time where we all have to collectively try to find a way out. And we shouldn't just sort of urge US and China to try to say, work together, I think it is the responsibility of the whole world, including Europe, and all the 27 countries agree with each other, and Europe with the global south. Instead of each country being sort of stuck in between US and China, Europe and global south should collectively stand together and try to sort of bash US and China's head together and say you have to find a way to work together. So whether it's the global south and Europe, or whether it's really like what Marjorie was saying, the business, I mean, the clients that I work with, they are tirelessly trying to find very innovative ways to try to navigate through this very complex geopolitical background to still try to thrive. And as a trained economist, I always believe in the power of economic motivation. So I'll leave that as a hope. That is the rest of the world and all the business that we have here. Thank you.
What a wonderful end to a wonderful panel. Thank you to the panelists. I think we are leaving this discussion more enlightened, at least me. If we're leaving more optimistic, that's up to each of you to assess, but I think we are more insightful. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It has been a pleasure.
No.